Ms. Ramsey, I understand you recall events that occurred on September 11th in 2001. Can I ask you a few questions about your experiences?
Sure.
Okay, what were you doing the moment the Pentagon was struck?
At the time, I was at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. I was in infectious diseases. I'm a biochemist by training. So I had been to Washington with another colleague to brief Congress at that time, in all honesty, on West Nile virus. However, being in infectious diseases at the Centers for Disease Control, a major federal facility, we had constantly been concerned about the issues of bioterrorism, terrorism caused by some bioagent. So we were in Washington for West Nile virus, and the next day we were to be at the National Press Club to also discuss issues of West Nile virus. That appointment was at 10 o'clock in the morning. So I was in my hotel room on that Tuesday morning. It was one of the most beautiful days you can ever imagine. I can even remember thinking, Washington means so much to us, and it really does. And I went to Washington a lot, but it was such a beautiful day on that Monday and that Tuesday morning also. I was getting ready to go down to meet my colleague so that we could go to the National Press Club, and I had the television on. And it said a plane had hit one of the Twin Towers. Being aware that that was a very, very, very unusual event, it immediately puts in your mind, is this something else other than just a plane hitting? And so I went down to meet my colleague and I said, did you hear about the plane? He said, no. I said, once hit one plane. He said, the Twin Towers. He said, that's not just an accident. So we got in a taxi. We were always concerned there could be an agent on a plane, a bioagent, or something. Let me mention that for those of you who may not be aware, agents you think about are things like anthrax, smallpox, or other agents that what are called rogue or your enemy nations could possibly have and use on you. So we got in a taxi, skipped breakfast, everything, to go to our Washington offices in the Centers for Disease Control. When we got in the taxi, we didn't know the second plane had hit yet. The radio was on in the taxi. But we saw smoke to the right of us. We knew we were right at the White House, but we weren't sure of what had happened. So we were trying to get in the taxi to the Washington office. Things had not started occurring like everything getting stopped up. But as we were going to the Washington office, we heard the second plane had hit in New York, and we heard a plane was headed for the White House, and then we knew that plane, or the Capitol, we knew in our mind fairly sure that it had hit something before it got there, and it had been aimed for the Pentagon. So we saw the Pentagon burning. There isn't any way you can describe to anyone how you feel, because you know then that those persons are killed. And of course the people in the New York, you knew and had no idea of how many could be. When we got to the CDC Washington offices, the televisions were on, but also the building was already evacuated. The Capitol was already evacuated. But we knew we had certain roles that you've already been prepared for an event in case it occurs. So we went ahead and tried to get contact with our Atlanta offices. We could definitely see the smoke in the air from the Pentagon, and definitely knew the televisions were still able to be on. But we also knew that Washington itself was in great danger. We went to the Washington office and we immediately contacted our colleagues here who do major emergency outbreaks. Immediately, CDC activated their emergency plans and sent someone to to New York, one of the only planes in the air. And we started seeing how many hospital beds would be needed. I mean, that's an important thing when there's been a traumatic event. We realized it was in Washington too. all the emergency issues were immediately activated. One of my first just horrible memories is I can remember them saying, "We don't need many hospital beds. We need body bags," because there were so many deaths. So the trauma of all of that day, it was because we had certain work to do about getting people in the air. Are there any agents on these planes? What else is going to happen?
How do you think the U.S. can better prepare our country for further attacks?
And so they certainly have gotten the states a lot more prepared in case an event occurs. I think that, and certainly the Defense Department and the military have gotten more aware. And I think just making people themselves more aware. I mean, I think we ourselves are more aware that you need to be cautious in of all of your surroundings. So it is a very difficult issue, but I think since 9/11 that certainly the government, the federal and the state governments, as well as the cities, have become much more responsive to emergency responsive teams. And you can also see it in things that are not necessarily a terrorist, but a naturally occurring thing, such as when it happened in New Orleans.
Did you feel safe?
I didn't feel safe. I can remember every trash can we passed, we would go way around it in case there would have been something had been implanted in a trash can. Also, we walked by the White House and the Capitol to get back to the hotel, and the Secret Service and every other security agent person in Washington were just lining the streets with guns because they didn't know where people would come from other than these planes that had hit. So no, I didn't feel safe then. I knew where as safe as I could be. And also the next morning, as I came out of my hotel to go to a little coffee shop that obviously was not open, nothing was open that morning, there was just many Army Humvees and other armored cars. It was so close to the White House and Capitol that they were just lining the streets. So you really felt like you were in like a war state. You had this, just like everyone in the world, in the back of the mind, what can happen next?
What were you doing the moment the first tower or Pentagon was struck?
I was at work and I was taking a phone call. The computer was up in front of me with email coming in, and an email came through announcing that a possible terroristic attack had happened and that we, being federal employees, were placed on alert and to stay tuned. So I was just sitting there waiting for more information on what to do when things started to happen. The next thing that happened was the first tower was hit with the plane. Then it elevated our alert system. But at the time, I thought, well, we all thought that maybe it was just a misguided aircraft. Then when the second plane hit, we knew it was a terroristic attack by then. So we were evacuated. And then by the time I got home from my office, I knew it was a full-fledged terroristic attack, that other planes were involved, that the White House was a possible site of attack, and that the Pentagon had been hit. So things kind of unfolded that day in phases of time. All started at being at work and being alerted to the fact that something possible was happening to something definitely had happened.
Who do you know that had a direct view of what happened on September 11th?
The person, I know several people who had a direct impact for in different ways. My mother-in-law was there, as you heard from her earlier. She was there for work in Washington, D.C. My brother was there building federal facilities on the New Jersey shore, which if you know where Hoboken, New Jersey is, you can literally see New York from across the bay. He was there and he was directly impacted. Both of them had to stay there and assist in different capacities. But the person I know who was most directly impacted was one of my childhood friends. And he was in the building across from the World Trade Center tower. And he was inside the building when the first plane hit. They stayed in there for a few minutes, just sort of paralyzed. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what was happening. And then as things progressed, just pandemonium ensued in the city. So they were evacuated out of their building, and he saw some really, really horrific things that impacted him greatly, mentally, physically. So he was one of my childhood friends. His name was Danny.
What did he see?
It's really hard to describe what he saw. I talked to him a couple of weeks after 9/11, and he was having nightmares because what he saw, in addition to this, the billowing smoke and the debris flying and the plane flames bursting into air, the thing that impacted him the most was seeing human beings jump from the towers. And he said it was just like raining people. And he said it was the most horrific thing to think. What was going through their mind? Either collapse with the building, stay in here and choke on the smoke, or jump to my death and let it be my choice how I die. And he couldn't get that out of his mind, and it gave him nightmares for months.
How did he cope with the nightmares after?
It took him, he said it was about 2 or 3 months, that just every night he was having night terrors, and he lost work. Of course, everybody lost work. There wasn't a building to go into to do your work until things settled down. So like many New Yorkers, he was out of work. Because he had more downtime, he just kept recalling the images of the people jumping. At night, he would have night terrors, night sweats, wake up screaming, literally vomiting because he was so upset. And about 5 months into it, he couldn't take it, and he flew home to Atlanta. We were childhood friends. We met here in Atlanta. He flew home to be with his family, and his family recognized that he had post-traumatic stress disorder. And he went to a Charter Beachford. He went to a psychological facility, and he was in there for about 2 months, and they helped him cope. And I think he's still coping. I think it's still something that haunts him to this day to see those images.
Did you ever feel like something like this could happen?
That's an interesting question, because the very fact that I did think something like this could happen caused me to literally go into a state of shock on September 11th. On September 8th, my family and I were driving through Hamilton, Mississippi on our way to my cousin's wedding. And we got into this little rural area of town. We were all just kind of tired of driving. We were very quiet in the car. But the children were in the back seat. And I can still remember to this day where I was. I was just driving on this rural highway, 2-lane road. Over to the right was like a dollar store and a Subway. And I was just like, golly, we're really in small town America. And I didn't voice that, but I was thinking it. And then all of a sudden, I just asked my husband, what is the big buildings in New York called, the really world famous ones? And he said, you're talking about the Empire State Building? And I said, no, the other ones that everybody knows about all over the world. He said, the World Trade Center towers? And I said, yes. I feel like something monumental is going to happen to the World Trade Center towers. I feel like it's going to be so big and so horrible that it's going to impact the entire world, and it's going to be something that our children are going to study even before we're gone. A lot of things when we study in history, it's things that have happened before we were even born. But this is going to be such a worldwide event that our kids in our lifetime are going to learn about. And that was on September 8th. And then after I said that, he said, something already has happened like that. There was a bomb planted in the bottom of one of the World Trade Center towers. And I said, yeah, but that didn't affect the whole building. It didn't affect thousands of people. It didn't, cause the entire world to start paying attention to the World Trade Center towers. I said, this is going to be huge. And that was a Saturday. We went to the a wedding Saturday night, came home Sunday. I didn't think any more about it. I had no more thoughts about something like this happening. Monday came and went like a normal work day, and then September 11th happened, and I went into work and started seeing the email messages that something bad had happened in New York. But it did not dawn on me at the time that it was a terroristic attack. It didn't dawn on me at the time that I had just thought 3 days before that something like this was going to happen. And in fact, it didn't even occur to me that what I had thought had came to fruition until after we had evacuated the federal buildings. We had come home. I came and sat in this very chair, and in that little bit of time that it took me to get home, the towers had collapsed. And then Bill came home, my husband, and when he opened the front door and saw me, the first thing he said was, "You weren't off. You just said this was going to happen." And then it sunk in. Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine that I thought this could happen and that this would happen, and then I had given it such a cavalier thought, and this is monumental. And when it sunk in, I went into shock, like a burn victim goes into shock. And I had to be covered up in blankets. I couldn't stop shaking. I think I shook for several hours. And to this day, I get fearful thinking, if I ever have a thought like that again, what could happen? So whenever I have any thought like that, instead of just putting it out of my head like I did thinking about the World Trade Center towers, I think about it a long time, for fear that if I don't think about it a long time, something really bad will happen. So it actually, after I went into shock thinking that I had predicted something like this, I never cried. I never really shed a tear about 9/11 and all of the lives that were lost. But then if you fast forward to this year, we went to New York, and I went to the World Trade Center Tower Memorial, and I saw all the names of all the victims in marble and the beautiful fountains, and I finally lost several years later. It's terrible. So sorry.
What was your reaction after the attack of the Twin Towers?
Sheer anger. I mean, other than being in shock, it was just like learning about it came in phases. My reaction to it came in phases. And when I learned that it was a terrorist attack and not just a random plane that had, run into a building like I first thought, there were images on the news of people in different countries celebrating the demise of America. In fact, there was one lady in Afghanistan that was so happy, and she was doing this crazy thing with her tongue that clearly was her way of expressing her excitement that this had happened. And gosh, I just remember being so angry and saddened. And I know that we take for granted in America that we have, freedom to choose what we want to be. We have freedom to choose where we want to live. We can write what we want to write and say what we want to say. It is America, land of the free and home of the brave. And I thought, this will show that America is brave. And America will always be land of the free. But I think my anger and seeing the reaction of other countries made me realize how good we've got it here in America, and how those people who were reacting in the way that they were, they don't have those same freedoms that we do. And whether it's their religious beliefs, whether it's brainwashing by their governments, whatever it is that caused them to celebrate, I will never be able to grasp that. I will never understand that. I will never be able to relate because I didn't grow up that way. I grew up being able to disagree. I grew up being able to worship in the way that I believe, whereas those countries don't have the luxury of those free choices. So I try to keep that in mind when I think about how angry I am at people who can actually celebrate the loss of so many lives in such a tragic, meaningless way.
How do you think the U.S. can better prepare our country for any further attacks?
That's a good question. I think it's important for America to recognize the differences in countries and how it's important to build collaborative relationships with those countries and to respect our differences, but yet bridge some gaps. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of people don't like the government spying. They don't like government interference and things like that. On the other hand, we've got to have surveillance. We have to have spies. We have to have people who are watching through cameras and subway systems, and we have to go through the security clearance at airports. We have to do these things that really interfere with our conveniences and delay us sometimes to ensure that we are safe. I think all of the things America has done to try to protect us, we just have to keep forging ahead with those things that we do and build relationships with different countries.
How did your job react to the attacks?
Wow, CDC, in several ways. The first reaction that CDC had was response. I mean, my mother actually worked at CDC at the time, and she was responsible for getting people out, deploying them from here in Atlanta to DC, Washington, and Pennsylvania within a matter of hours. They're Commissioned Corps officers and other emergency responders. So CDC just went on like hyper alert and hyper activity to get emergency responders out to ground zero and everywhere. In addition to that, our security really ramped up. Every time we go on CDC property, we have to go through security to get in the parking lot. We have to go through security in the door. We have to log in with a card key. And used to be, you could just pretty much walk in and bring a guest in with you. Now it's really difficult to bring anyone in to CDC for fear of different or the wrong people getting into our facilities. So CDC has reacted, A, in our response, and B, in really beefing up our security to make our facility a very safe place for the employees.
When you were at work, did you, as the attacks happened, did you feel safe at work?
I don't think I thought about my safety. I feel safe at work every day, but I know that there are a lot of security measures in place to keep us safe, even though I can't see them. I know there's a lot of behind the scenes, carefully monitoring the comings and goings of people on our property, the activity of our computers and our phones. So that day, I did feel very safe, and I always feel safe. But I have been at CDC when there have been bomb threats. I've been at CDC when there have been dangerous protesters out on the front lawn. And on those days, I feel more threatened than I did that day. But that day, my mind was in a completely different place. It's almost like it happened so fast that you didn't have time to think about your own safety. Even when they evacuated us, we felt like, okay, well, we're leaving because something horrific has happened in America, not because we're unsafe. It was just a different mindset.
Right. Do you feel like another attack could penetrate the security of the nation?
I think America and other countries are always at risk of attacks. I hope we never ever experience something of this magnitude ever again. I hope that our security measures are in place to prevent that. But yeah, I do think that any day, any given day, in the blink of an eye, something horrific can happen again.
Miss McDonald, I understand your life changed somewhat on September 11th, 2001. Can you tell me what happened?
I sure can. I was working for the Centers for Disease Control in the Bioterrorism Preparedness and Emergency Response Program, and I was the administrative officer. And immediately upon hearing that the towers had been hit, we went into a 24-hour response. We were the only people to have airplanes in the air that afternoon. We had the responsibility of getting supplies up there. Our main objective that day was to determine whether or not there were any chemicals involved with the planes that might affect the people up there.